Welcome back to Edwards Gaming and Hardware. This is just a quick comparison side by side between my old RTX 2080 XC Ultra versus my new EVGA 3090 FTW3. This is not going to be very long. I unfortunately don't have a bunch of other cards that I can compare this to, so I'm having to go with what I own personally. So we'll get into it here. What I went ahead and did was I ran some default benchmarks. Now these are all at the default clocks. I did not use any overclocking on these at all. It is the standard self-overclocking that the cards themselves do. I did not adjust any core or memory on those, so I want to make sure I make that absolutely clear. I will do a later video where I do some overclocking on it. It will be straight air overclocking. I will not be using water or extreme cooling on these. Eventually I want to put it underwater, but that right now is not something that's going to happen right away. As you can see on a lot of these scores, the card itself increased dramatically on almost everything. The exception being World of Tanks on the 1080 Ultra setting. Everything else went up quite a bit, actually. Port Royal showed a 93% increase in score. That's just going from the 2080 to the 3090. I think a large part of that was the way they redid the cores. Also the massive increase in the amount of available memory that it has. I think that really helped it as well. You can see I went from a 6896 default score on my 2080 to a 13340 default on the 3090. On Time Spy Extreme, I had a 70, almost 71% increase. I went from a 5614 to a 9573. Firestrike Ultra, which is still pretty relevant to a lot of the games out there. It's a DirectX 11 benchmark, so a lot of games out there do have DirectX 11, even more, or DirectX 9, which is kind of sad in this day and age, but that one went from a 7007 to a 12676, showing about an 81% increase. I did include the Heaven benchmark. If you have never ran that benchmark, it's actually a nice little one to showcase tessellation. I really enjoy it personally. That had a 57% increase. So I mean, it was pretty good, not quite as good as the other benchmarks, just because I think that one kind of, it's capping out really, it's losing its usefulness, but I still enjoy it just for the visuals, if nothing else. Superposition, that is one of the newer benchmarks. That one does support the higher resolutions, and I really enjoy that one for just seeing everything that it can really do, what your cards are truly capable of. The first one is in the 1080p extreme mode, which is actually pretty taxing on your system. You wouldn't think it would be as taxing. You'd actually think it would be less than the 4K. But as you can see here side by side, it actually doesn't get quite as high a score as the 4K does. But I did still have an increase of about 73% on the 1080p extreme, going from a 7337 to a 12698. And I had a 75% increase going from the on the 4K, going from 9676 to 16968. So the increase was right about the same amount, so percentage wise. So I mean, I'll still say that that's very comparable. It was definitely smooth as butter. There was not a single stutter, there wasn't any lag, screen tearing, nothing. I really will say that that was very nice to actually see it running the way it's supposed to. Now, World of Tanks, that's still a really popular game that a lot of people play. And this is the World of Tanks Encore. It's for the benchmark on it. I will say in the 1080 Ultra, that is pretty much getting to be CPU bound at that point. It's not really doing much. There wasn't a huge increase. It was only 8% increase from the 2080 to the 3090. So, I mean, that's not a major increase at all. So that's definitely getting CPU bound at this point. It went from a 37,287 to a 4326. Now, moving that to the 2K Ultra setting, which was its high setting, you can see there's much more of a separation between the two now. There was a 42% increase. So, I mean, we went from a 27,183 to a 38,720. Score-wise, I mean, that's a lot of difference right there. It actually, with this GPU, it's almost CPU bound at that point. It only dropped 1,600 points, so very little drop. So definitely that's showing more CPU bound. Now, I was going to show you in the next slide here is the actual FPS on these cards. Now, I included 5 of the original 8 benchmarks that I had. I did not include Port Royal, Time Spy, or Firestrike. And the main reason I did this was I use MSI Afterburner to be able to have my on-screen display on there. And for some reason, it would glitch out and it would not give me the correct max FPS on there. So I wanted to make sure I stayed consistent with all these. So since I could not get an accurate reading on those, I went ahead and dropped those off of my charts. And in lieu of those, at the end of this, you can see I added 2 actual games. One is Ark, which is, I wanted to use that just because it is an MMO. It's got a very large area to be able to cover, so it takes a big hit on FPS, especially in the more detailed areas. And then I also included Quake 2 RTX. The reason I did that was I just wanted an actual RTX title on here, something to use. I really was wanting to use some of the newer titles. Unfortunately, my version of Cyberpunk 2077 does not work good. It is not to a state that I'm comfortable in really testing it yet. Once they get it fixed, I will include those scores along with the game control. But for now, I'm only doing these 7. First one's going to be Heaven. Again, I like to use this because of the visuals in it. And if you remember back to the prior slide, the increase wasn't that much. Percentage-wise, it was a 57% increase, which was one of the lower increases out of all of them. However, when you look at the actual FPS improvement on here, the low frame rate didn't increase a whole lot. It only went up by about 16. If you compare, make this a little easier here. If you compare the 34 to the 50, which is the 2 lows, that's not a big increase. But if you look at the average frame rate, 94 compared to the 148, that's a huge increase. I mean, that's an almost 50% increase right there. So that's definitely a significant increase. Along with the max frame rate, went from 193 to 303. So that's about a 50% improvement there. Moving into superposition, the 1080p Extreme. This was where I was talking about the 2 benchmarks here, the 1080 Extreme and the 4K optimized. The system actually takes a bigger hit with the 1080p Extreme than it does with the 4K optimized, just because of the amount of graphics that are turned on and the settings that are on there. So I wanted to include this just because there are a lot of people that do still game at 1080. Personally, me, I do a lot of my gaming at 2K, and I've been starting to move some titles into 4K as well, depending on which title it is. Some of them work well in 4K, some of them just still don't run very well in 4K at all, so I'm just not wanting to use it. In superposition, you can see the minimum frame rate here went from a 43 on that 2080 to a 74 for that 1% low. So I mean, that's a massive increase. I mean, that's almost 100% increase. So that to me was really, really nice. Same with the average frame rate, went from 55 to 95. Again, almost doubling the frame rate on there, and then a 72 to a 131 on the max frame rate. So I mean, overall it basically almost doubled the scores. I was very pleased with that, especially at that setting, my control. Now in the 4K setting, you can see minimum was 60 and it jumped to a 97. So again, about a 45% increase. The average went from a 72% to a 127. So I was very pleased with that. That was a good 80% increase there. The maximum frame rate went from an 89 to 158. Again, this is in 4K, so to me that's really highly impressive. If you've ever seen the superposition benchmark, it is highly detailed. There's a lot of objects flying around there. There's a lot of shadows, there's a lot of reflections. It's really well done. If you haven't seen it, I really highly recommend running it at least once or looking at some videos for it. It's really interesting, is I guess how I'll put it. But moving on, World of Tanks, Encore, the 1080p Ultra versus the 2K Ultra. Now this is what I expect to see when you go from 1080 to 2K. You'll see a drop in scores, which is normal. The FPS should be a little bit lower on 2K and then even 4K. But like I said, that superposition is kind of specialized. It's going to be the opposite. It's weird how they do it. But for the World of Tanks, the 1080 Ultra, again, we went from 192 to 211 frames per second, which is not significant. That to me is just, it was only an 8% increase, and it's just not as dramatic as some of the other titles could be. And a lot of that, I think, is, like I said, it's just being very CPU bound. You can see it as well in the average frame rate. It went from 209 to 235. It's only a difference of, 26? So, again, not very much FPS increase. The max frame rate, it did increase 302 to 451, which is about a 50% increase. But there was not a whole lot of areas where you hit that max frame rate. Most of it was at average. That's why there's such a small difference between the 1% low and the average. The maximum was just a kind of very limited areas, very small time frames, so it wasn't that impactful. Again, I think this game is just getting to be more CPU bound than anything. Now, the World of Tanks 2K was a lot different. We went from 119 to 185 FPS, which is quite significant of an increase. I definitely will say it was what I was more wanting to see with an increase. It was about a 40 to 43% increase. Same with the average, 168 to 224. We had a nice separation there. It was about a 40% increase there. And then the max frame rate, 264 to 380. Again, they follow the same rules as what I said with the 1080. They're going to be a little bit lower of a level, and that's just because you're going from 1080 to 2K. But I am very pleased overall with those scores. Definitely very playable in the game itself. Online, I don't have any issues whatsoever. I do still play it pretty often, and I have everything maxed out in that game, and I don't have a single stutter no matter how many tanks are on screen, smoke, explosions going on, foliage. It doesn't matter. I don't stutter, and I really, really like that now. On Arc, this is one of the titles, I will say, that it does dip below the 60 FPS mark with this 3090, and I'm kind of disappointed with that. I thought for sure it would actually perform better, but it just didn't. We're only seeing about a 25% increase here between the 2080 and the 3090. So that's telling me it was a little bit GPU bound, but not that much. I think it's more CPU bound, even though I have a 3900X by AMD. So it's not a bad processor. I think it's just a little bit low on the megahertz side of things. I'm hoping with AMD's new processors coming out that maybe that'll help pick things up a little bit more. We did have an increase from 41 to 55 on the minimum, 62 to 82 on the average, and 159 to 190 on the maximum. I will say it stayed pretty close to the average there, about 82. The only time it really dipped down into the 52s was when I got into real highly infested dino areas. You get into some of these players' bases where they have hundreds of dinosaurs everywhere, and it really does tax the card quite a bit more. Now, this again is played at max settings. That's played at a 2K resolution with, 4K resolution with everything turned on. So maximum everything on there. I had anti-aliasing maxed out, anisotropic, shadows, view distance, foliage, grass, everything is just turned on to maximums. So I am not disappointed in that. It definitely did a better job than my 2080 did. It had a lot fewer slowdowns, so I'm very pleased with that. It made the game look really nice and play very well, so I was happy with that. The Quake 2 RTX time demo, again, this is at 2K. It stayed very playable frame rates. It used to dip down. This is at its default settings with everything in the settings menu turned on to full, but it's just ran at the time demo one. You can see with the 2080, it dipped down into the 40s. It never dipped below 60 on the 3090. It actually stayed, the minimum frame rate was the maximum for the 2080. So I'm pleased with that. It was about a 30% increase. So pretty good overall. Again, Quake 2 is kind of a lot older of a game. I actually enjoyed it when it first came out, and now seeing the RTX version with ray tracing, I'm really enjoying it a lot. One of the other games that I eventually want to test here is Minecraft with ray tracing. I just want to see comparison between my 2080 and the 3090. I just want to test it out to see how big of a hit it actually takes on that ray tracing with it. So in the future, I will be showing some other titles on here as well. But this is just a general overall view. I just wanted to give you guys a heads up on the increases that I see. And remember, please like and subscribe. Let me know what you guys want to see me do. If there's certain games that you want me to showcase, I'm more than happy to either live stream them or just record them and have them on my channel so you're able to see how it'll play on my system versus what you have.